Hello, everyone. My name is Gil Penalosa, and this is Cities for Everyone, the webinar, where every other week I invite fascinating people to share their stories, their experiences, and knowledge so that it will help all of us become better, passionate advocates on creating cities that are more equitable, sustainable, and playful. Originally, I'm from Bogota, Colombia, but I've been living in Toronto, Canada for the last 25 years. And about 19 years ago, I created 880 Cities. I've been very fortunate to have worked in over 350 cities all over the world. Actually, today, I'm hosting from Dubai, where I'm working on healthy cities, on creating 880 cities for everyone. And today we have a very special session. We have Wes Marshall, who is going to tell us about killed by a traffic engineer. I mean, someone has to be at fault. It cannot be just shared responsibility, the driver and the person walking. No, how about the elected officials that could have made streets safe but failed to do so? How about the engineers that knew that they were not making the streets as safe as they should be? So this is very interesting. This is a fascinating book that just came out, and Wes, a professor of Colorado University, is going to tell us. Wes, thank you very much for accepting the invitation, and we have a full house, totally full, from all over the world. We have people from Kenya and South Africa and Chile and Paraguay and Mexico, all corners of the US and Canada and many in Europe. So thank you. Wes, welcome.
Thank you, Gil, for having me here. Yeah, so I'm Wes Marshall. I'm a professor of civil engineering at the University of Colorado, Denver. I have a joint appointment in urban planning as well. And what I did, it's a long book. It's like a 400-page book, but it's a short chapters, easy read. And I can't clearly go through the entire book. So I'm trying to give some of the big picture themes and basically talk about some of the rabbit holes I went down to. I was very frustrated with a lot of the stuff that I was seeing, I was doing in the traffic engineering world, and I wanted to see the origin story of like the science behind these things. So that's essentially what the book is, trying to figure out that piece of it. And oftentimes you get to the bottom of those rabbit holes, and there's not nearly as much science as I was led to believe, as I think a lot of traffic engineers think there is behind why we do what we do.
Wonderful. So we are all eager because as I say, someone is responsible. We cannot just blame the drivers or God for when people die, when people are injured, or even when people just don't go out because they are afraid. I said, it's the modern day wolf. For hundreds of years, what terrified children were the wolves. Today's wolf are the cars. Unfortunately, and it does not have to be that way.
Thanks for doing these webinars. Thanks for inviting myself and people like me to talk about a lot of the work they're doing. It's for me, it's a great opportunity. I'm excited to do so. Um, but before I get into things, I think it might help to start a little bit with my origin story. So I grew up in Watertown, Massachusetts. This was a town founded a couple hundred years before traffic engineers even existed. Like to me as a kid, like this was the big road next to where I grew up. One lane of traffic in each direction, on-street parking on either side. If I turn the other way, this would be considered the big intersection I would have to cross to get to, like my favorite pizza place or places like that. And it was still one lane in each direction. I never thought much about transportation back then, but I still avoided those big roads and I would bike or walk on streets like this one. 24 feet curb to curb. It felt smaller, it felt slower because it again had parking on both sides. This is not me and my friends, but we felt like we could walk our bike anywhere in town. And this was a town where pretty much every kid could walk or bike to school. Like we had 8 or 9 elementary schools. This was a quarter-mile ped shed around those elementary schools. And as I got older and I wanted to venture further out, I could jump on the bus and get to Fenway Park or Harvard Square. And from there, I felt like the Red Line could take me pretty much anywhere. I then went to Charlottesville, Virginia, to University of Virginia to get a degree in civil engineering. At first, transportation wasn't my focus. And even though Charlottesville spent pretty much the entirety of my 4 years there, widening Route 29 that cuts through the city, the students, at least I felt very much insulated from that. But one thing I did notice is that the traffic on 29 was just as bad, if not worse, at the end of my 4 years there compared to when I got there. So after UVA, I went back to Watertown. I started working at Sasaki Associates. I was a civil engineer there. It was a pretty progressive firm. I was doing site engineering, and that meant doing, kind of being a jack of all trades. I was doing some transportation, some hydrology, some geotech, some structural. But the pieces that frustrated me the most were always the transportation elements, mostly because the things we were building were never nearly as good as the stuff I saw around me. Once you're on the job as a young engineer, you're given about a half dozen of these 1,000-page guidebooks, and you rely on them because most civil engineers have only taken one, maybe two transportation engineering courses as an undergrad. In fact, a lot of folks I've talked to have took zero, and they still can end up becoming a professional engineer. And those manuals would make it hard to build the sort of streets that I knew. It would make it impossible to replicate the sort of multi-way boulevards like this is Com Ave. You see this is only half of it. So you see the train in the middle, you see the kind of mobility lanes in the middle, the access lanes on the side, all of which surrounded by buildings with little to no dedicated parking. And nowhere in these books could I come close to finding, this is Acorn Street in Beacon Hill, which is 8 feet curb to curb. I then changed jobs. I moved to, I guess, what would be considered a more traditional civil engineering firm. I moved to Connecticut, and this was the first time I ever lived in a place that I could not leave my street without being in a car. And this was the first street I would see. Big roads, big parking lots, as far as the eye could see. Sidewalks, bike facilities were pretty much non-existent. I then moved to a smaller town in Connecticut, thinking things would be better. And even though the adjacent street you see here was much smaller, this still wasn't one that you would feel comfortable walking or biking on. And I should have been, what was a 5-minute walk to literally this place is called Sal's Corner Store, and there was no safe way to walk or bike there. I would ask my neighbors, like, how do you live like this? And nobody even understood what I was talking about. They'd be like, just drive over there. And I think to myself that they have no idea what they're missing. So those frustrations, I got my professional engineering license, and then I applied to graduate school. I went to the University of Connecticut, and when I arrived, my new advisor, Norman Garrick, who I know some of you know, he put me on a parking project, and he left town to go on sabbatical to Jamaica. And my thinking at the time was, oh, feels kind of boring. But prior to leaving, he gave me one name, Donald Shoup, and this was before the high cost of free parking came out. So I started digging into Donald Shoup's research on parking and transportation and cities. And, I was making, slides like this back in like 2004, where, I think from Donald Shoup's work, I was learning the shocking lack of science behind some of the numbers like this. Like I would make a slide like this, where this is from the parking generation guidebook saying we need exactly 10.6 vehicles per 1,000 square feet of gross floor area. And if you draw that line on this graph, it would look like this. But when you look more closely at the data, it would look like this. So in early 2005, I wrote my first paper about parking in these mixed-use cities, like these small New England town centers. Half of them were built before before parking regulations, before traffic engineers existed, and half of them were built in more contemporary times. At the time, I was taking a GIS course. I was using this research, as a basis for my term project for that course. So I ended up mapping things in here, and you can see one of these examples of a town center. The pinkish color is where the parking was. The hatch beige color is where the buildings were. And you see just how much more land is being consumed by parking. And we did interviews with people there, and they still complained that there wasn't enough parking. But we went out there dozens and dozens of times trying to figure out when the busiest day of the year was. And this was that data. So yes, there was one parking lot that was 90 to 100% full. That was pretty full, but most of them were pretty close to empty. So if you look at parking more holistically from a center wide, it just wasn't the problem that we think it is. So why would we want to provide more parking than you think is necessary? Well, part of it is we're scared of stories like this or this. And this means that being conservative often means providing more parking than we think we need. Well, why do we do this? Well, one is fear, like fear of those things we're just talking about. Another is that transportation is a subdiscipline of civil engineering. So when I was an graduate, I'm taking courses in structural engineering and hydrology and geotechnical engineering. In courses like those, we are taught to figure out, something like the design load. We typically multiply it by 3 to give ourselves a factor of safety. A bigger beam might cost us more, but it'll be safer. And this factor of safety mentality seeps through all of civil engineering, which makes sense when it comes to a culvert or when we're designing a bridge or building. But the factor of safety mindset does not work as well in transportation. Why? Well, Mother Nature doesn't care how big my beam is. It's not going to be any windier. Um, but if I put a wider road in front of a human being, they will behave differently. So, for example, here's a picture I took. It was summer. I did a talk up in Big Sky, Montana. This is right near Yellowstone. This is an example of what might be considered a perfectly well-engineered road. Like the area to the right of where the travel lanes are is what we call the clear zone. And the clear zone gives us that factor of safety. So here's a diagram from one of the AASHTO roadside design guidelines of the clear zone. In this case, they're asking for 31 feet of space to the right of where the cars are. This exact table was in my undergraduate textbook, which I see up there on the shelf. And what does it insinuate? Well, the column on the left shows us that the bigger and bigger clear zone, and the column on the right shows us that we're going to get a reduction in crashes. So in other words, the bigger we make the clear zone, the safer we're going to be, which is pretty much what we built here. Now, at the other end of the spectrum, like here's a mountain, formerly known as Mount Evans. It's right here in Colorado. It's about a half an hour from me. It's now called Mount Blue Sky, and it's, I think, the highest paved road in North America. It goes up to a 14,000 peak. And if you look at this, you see that there is absolutely clear zero clear zone. And if you look at the crash data, this road, as this person from the Colorado DOT tells us, it has very few crashes. Why? Well, you behave very differently as a driver on each of these roads, right? You cannot afford to make a mistake on one of them, and it's not that big a deal to make a mistake on the other road. So let's take another look at the one near Yellowstone. And to the right of the picture I showed you, there's this sign right there. And if you pay attention, you'll see dozens of these little white crosses as you're going up this road towards Big Sky, um, representing where people have died. So I'm not saying that clear zones are definitively safe or unsafe. What I'm saying is that it's not as clear cut as the traffic engineers would lead you to believe. In fact, it's not as clear cut as the traffic engineers themselves, like me, were led to believe. So take a look at this highway in Florida and compare it to this. This is a highway in Canada. This is in Saskatchewan. The one with the trees right up to the edge, again, it feels like it requires a very different level. But the one in Canada is the perfectly well-engineered road, but it actually has a much worse safety record. Interestingly, this is the well-regarded cross-section showing what the Florida DOT is trying to push through urban areas. Um, if you think about what the definition of a clear zone is too, like this is the space on the side of the road where we want out-of-control drivers to recover. So it doesn't make any sense to put the pedestrians and the bicyclists in the clear zone right where we are planning for run-off-the-road drivers to go. Of course it doesn't. But designs like this that actually have a sidewalk are being hailed as a major improvement, which isn't wrong, considered a lot of the transportation system that we've provided. But to me, looking at a road like this, it feels almost we really aren't doing too well. So, how do we fix this? Well, many cities will declare Vision Zero. But for most cities, I think Vision Zero ends up being a little bit more than a catchphrase. Like we're doing almost the same things we were before, just under a different umbrella. That reminds me of this, I think it's a season 4 episode of The Office where Michael Scott is having some money problems, and I think Creed tells him that he should declare bankruptcy. He initially confuses bankruptcy with a witness protection program, but then he walks over to the reception desk and says this.
I declare bankruptcy! Don't just say the word bankruptcy and expect anything to happen. I didn't say it, I declared it. Still, that's not anything.
So in other words, it's been business as usual. So again, how do we fix this? Well, we could heed the advice of folks like Mike Bloomberg. In God we trust, everyone else bring data, which it makes perfect sense because we all want a more data-driven approach to things like road safety, to things like Vision Zero. And that is exactly what Boulder, Colorado did, at the outset of their Vision Zero efforts. In a presentation I saw way back then, when they first declared Vision Zero, the city engineer started off with what traffic engineers would refer to as the three E's. The three E's represent our conventional approach to attacking a road safety problem. So the Boulder engineer said what made perfect sense, that they were going to add a fourth E to the POT evaluation. And when they dug through the data, what did they find? Well, they found that most of our crashes are caused by human error. And if human error is the problem, what's the solution? Well, the magic elixir is often technology. And back when I was on a sabbatical in Australia, this was 2017, a professor from MIT came up and gave a presentation, this place called City Talk, where they had like 200 people watching. They brought in speakers from all over the world, similar to this. And he showed this autonomous intersection where every car is getting a reservation. They're flying through this intersection. And then he compared it to the delay you'd see at a conventional intersection. And he said the autonomous intersection, he declared it the future of urbanism. And he got a standing ovation from 200 people there. I'm just sitting there thinking, like, well, what the heck happens if there's like one bicyclist or one kid trying to walk across the street? Or if not every car is autonomous? Because guess what? People love their cars. People love driving. And what he was suggesting there does not work when you add one human to the mix. And if you look at the history of technology as a solution, it's always been this carrot dangling ahead of us. You read Peter Norton's great book, Autonorama, about this. It's been happening for 50, 60 years. And they've been saying the same thing for a while with autonomous cars. The most recent study on safety I saw said this, that, yeah, they're safer except dawn, dusk, and whenever they're turning. I guess don't get me started on the Tesla stuff. Anyways, traffic engineers, some of us are happy to wait for technology to save the day. Others will go back to the three E's. And if 90+% of our crashes are caused by human behavior, this implies what? That 90+% of our solutions need to correct those behaviors, which typically means focusing on education and enforcement. So a lot of Vision Zero cities will start with the enforcement route, and they'll start cracking down on the jaywalkers or the scofflaw cyclists. In fact, I think New York City, they issued, I think, 43 tickets to bicyclists one year and only one to truck drivers, even though the numbers of people killed by those modes were the inverse. Like 43 people were killed by truck drivers. Here's a clip
Those will get caught speeding.
Guy in the red helmet's going 16.
Come on, stopping, please.
some Washington D.C. where they pulled over bicyclists for going 16 and a 15 on a trail. If we really want a data-driven approach to safety, like that isn't it. But we know the problems with enforcement is temporary. There's equity issues, all that sort of stuff. A lot of people think of the cameras as a cash grab. Like, yes, we know they could help, but politically it's sometimes difficult. So, like when Boulder looked at their crash data and realized they had a massive human error problem, they put out this PSA, which is similar to what you see for most agencies. Like they tell everyone to be better. And the reality is it's just not that simple. So here's an example crash. I happened to see this the morning it happened. It's from Vancouver, Washington. Two kids were jaywalking on the way to school, a 14-year-old and a 17-year-old. They're hit by this car. And when you think about what happened, it's so sad, but how does a crash like that get classified in our database? Well, like maybe that guy was speeding. If the guy was speeding, how do we fix that? Well, we put out PSAs like that. We tell people not to speed, that is dangerous. But when you look at the road we put in front of these people, like, is it an error? Would we consider that human error to go more than 35 on a road designed with that factor of safety mentality with much higher speeds in mind? Or here's a picture I found in Alexandria, Virginia. Like, is it human error to go faster than 25 on a road like this? The other thing we could blame on is jaywalking. Like we might, go back to our warrants and our MUTCD and realize, well, we need 93 people brave enough to cross at the peak hour in order to do something better than what we have there. But it's typically easier to do what? PSAs like this, like, and even though we know scare tactics usually make things worse than better, we still are doing things like this. But let's take a step back and look at the situation we put these kids in. Like, where's the nearest crosswalk? It's pretty far away. And even if you go to that crosswalk, it's not that great. And then you look at the built environment between where these kids were and where those crosswalks were. Sidewalks are just missing or they disappear and they just end haphazardly. And the corners of the streets that have to cross in between have these big turning radii where cars are going to be taking those corners pretty fast. So when you think about why those kids what they did, they made a very rational decision given the built environment we put in front of them. And then to add insult to injury, we told them they were wearing dark clothing. Of course they were. They're high school boys. Like, what do we expect them to do? If you look at that memorial that's out there now, like the sidewalk ends right after it. So to me, like we failed these kids, we failed their families, and we can do better. Now, here's another example. Pretend you're taking a left turn on a arterial. It's a permissive signal, so it's not the green arrow. Like, what are you trying to do with the situation? You're looking for a gap in the oncoming traffic. So there's only 1 or 2 lanes here, but it could be 3 or 4. So you're looking for a gap in the traffic. You might have some back pressure behind you. And what do we do at the exact same time? We tell this pedestrian it's their turn to cross. And how does this crash get classified in our database? We blame the driver usually. Oh, they should have been paying more attention, but we distracted them. How do we fix this? Well, we often tell, like the Colorado DOT did, to tell pedestrians, to tell dogs, they should make eye contact with the driver before they cross the street. And this is good advice for me to give to my kids, but it's not really great advice coming from a state DOT. And the DOT puts some people with these heads. It's actually the intersection right behind me here. And what does this mean for like the 1.2 million people in this country that are visually impaired, or I think it's 12 million that are visually impaired, 1.2 million people that are blind. Like the implications of it starts to feel like victim blaming. In this case, like we're still blaming this pedestrian for what is actually the driver's fault in terms of liability, but it isn't the driver's fault in terms of when you think about things from a more safe systems approach, including the fact that we know that it's hard to see where that pedestrian is given the way we design cars. All right, so what is the problem with all this? What's the problem with how these things get classified in our crash database? Well, for one, it lets us off the hook. As traffic engineers, like this is some road user's fault, and it always is some road user's fault. We also takes away our feedback loop, so we never learn from our mistakes. So yes, we still make changes to our infrastructure, but it's usually a Band-Aid here or a Band-Aid there. When you zoom out and you look at every city's high injury network, which typically show that 50 or 60% of our road fatalities take place in 5 or 6% of our streets, those are the most highly traffic engineered of all our streets. And you look at what we built, in this case, you have Colorado Boulevard in Denver, or this is Monaco right near a high school. You get frustrated and angry, and you see signs like this where kids are dying, like going back and forth to school. And the best we can do is, instead of fixing the more fundamental problems, we throw up a yellow sign to tell drivers to be more careful. And we can't even bother to slow down the speed limit in a school zone next to the school. Here's an elementary school in Denver. This is right next to Federal Boulevard. It's less than 150 feet from Federal, which is the worst of the worst when it comes to the high injury network. And there's not even a school zone. You can see we somehow fit the school zone between Federal and the school. There's a few feet in between. Do we have kids crossing Federal to get to school? Of course we do. Could we be bothered to slow cars down in Federal or make Federal safe? Not really. So yes, while something like this is ridiculous, it's actually better than a lot of what's out there. So when I look at infrastructure like that, I'd say at best we're maybe safety third. So I love my friends and colleagues at CDOT, but it's hard to say that it's really safety first. And when I gave a presentation there, they've since changed their Wi-Fi password. This is what they used. So we just don't have enough Band-Aids to fix the problems, and we can't put Band-Aids on intersections like this that there's no median, there's nothing, and it's 245 feet curb to curb. Like there's no way you could even put a traffic crossing guard there. They wouldn't have time to get into the street to help people cross. So we can do better, but it's not going to be stuff like this or this or this. And even worse, we tell kids to bike to school on streets like this instead of giving them better infrastructure. This is a picture I took in 2010 in Vancouver, British Columbia, when I was there for the IT International Conference. In this case, is even worse. Like a crash like this does not even get into our database because there's not an actual moving car in it. It's a during crash, so it's hard to even judge whether this is safer. And at the other end of the spectrum, we have places like Davis, California, where they put most of their schools in the same latitude. They connect it with a greenway. I took a bike tour there, and it was 45 minutes before we even crossed the street. Most of it was just things like this. And they go out of their way to make sure you have these north-south connections to every neighborhood to that greenway. And they make sure every kid has a low-stress route connecting them to the school, to that bike loop. Then you have my neighborhood. It's a new urbanist community here in Denver, built where the old airport was. And it's even though it's far better than most new developments, we're still building streets like this that are pretty much perfect for speeding. And I routinely see cars going like 70 on this street because we designed it like that. The results are not always pretty, to the point where on Colorado Public Radio, they interviewed one mother that walks 8 blocks one way. So they put her kid on the bus to go to a school that would have been 8 blocks in the other direction. So if such cases exist, we're doing something wrong. Compare that to anyone seen that show Old Enough on Netflix, where they send these toddlers out into the world to run their own errands. Like some of it feels insane, but most of it's not a big deal. It's no big surprise that only 10% of American kids walk or bike to school. In Japan, it's more like 80%. And those kids are usually doing so without a parent or a guardian. And if you do that in this country, there are plenty of examples with parents being arrested or threatened to be arrested or threatened of being child endangerment. Like this example from Tennessee, where a mother was arrested for letting her 10-year-old bike to school on streets like this. Here's a picture from near me, and this is in Aurora. And cars are taking this corner like at 50 plus, and we give this kid a 2-foot sidewalk. And even when we put in protected bike lanes, which are considered the best of the best for most cities, it's often not good enough. If we really want to build cities for everyone from 8 to 80, we can do better. This reminds me of I was in Philly at this year's ITE International Conference, and the day before I got here, Barbara Freed, she was a pediatric oncologist. She died in a bike crash. So that night I went over to see that, and there was a memorial put out there. And the infrastructure looks like what we want, right? This is what the Vision Zero cities are doing. It is easy to blame. It was an older driver, like he drove through the bike lane like it was a car lane. And she ended up dying. So it's easy to blame this on a human error crash. But when you think about these flex posts, what are they designed for? They're designed to pop back up at 70 miles per hour. Like we could have used something like this that dissipates some energy from the car while also protecting the people that are behind it. We are more than willing to do so for electrical transformers, for buildings. Like even in Philly, they do so to protect pedestrians. So you look back at that street, like if these little bollards, if that one in the foreground was actually in the background, like she'd be alive today. And if one death is too many, let me show you where we're at. Like it's a drop on the bucket compared to the fact that earlier this year, we have hit 4 million deaths in this country in cumulatively. And around the world, it's like 1.3, 1.35 million people die on the roads every year. Like how many of these people are kids? I tried to do the math and it's over 400,000. So of those 400 plus thousand deaths, like one of them was a 6th grader in Albuquerque. He was walking to her school carnival on a street like this. It meant crossing Louisiana Boulevard, high-speed multi-lane arterial. We put an unsignalized crosswalk. The data shows us that drivers, it's like a 50-50 chance that they're going to stop for someone trying to cross here. In this case, the driver didn't stop, and the easy solution is to blame the driver and to tell everyone that safety is a shared responsibility. And here's the FHWA approach, the Vision Zero and Safe Systems. They say the same thing. And we've been saying the same thing for 50 years. This is a paper I found in 1955. So to finish up, how do we really fix this? What should we be doing? Instead of waiting for kids to get hurt, or in fact, waiting for like 3 or 4 to get hurt in a short enough period of time to like hit our warrants, I want us to take a step back and do something and focus on something more fundamental. In her tidying up books, Marie Kondo talks about focusing on categories like clothing. She wants us to put all of your clothing in one place so you can get a sense of the scale of the problem. I want to do the same thing with road safety. Instead of playing whack-a-mole, let's try to focus on something like what could be that category. And in the book, I start with kids. So I don't have many equations in the book, but I do have this one. Like kids plus active transportation plus transit minus parking is how we get to safer places. Like, what does this really mean? It means realizing that kids like don't exactly walk briskly across the crosswalks. It means that if we're going to use technology, why not use it to give a meandering kid or an old guy a little more time to cross the street when he needs it? It means that we know that cars and drivers can't see, like there's the video, I'll skip that, but 13 kids are in front of him. This driver still can't see those kids. So what would that mean in terms of design? Like pulling that stop bar back. We could use bubble wrap cars, like in the show Green Eggs and Ham on Netflix. Anyone watch that? It's a pretty good show. But a lot of our cars are looking like this. So we can do a better job in terms of design. We can design our intersections to make sure that you're daylighting them, where you're removing those blind spots. So a lot of Vision Zero cities are putting, the upside down triangle where they're prioritizing pedestrians first. Why not take it a step further and put kids at the top? The other thing I'd say is, one of the best things to figure out what we need is to get rid of what we don't. And if we want to build cities for everyone, a lot of times that's parking. And if you think about the way I was taught to design a street, I started from the center line and move my way out. You figure out how much space you need for cars, and then you start working your way out. If we follow that pyramid, you could do the opposite. Figure out how much space you need for pedestrians and work your way inward. And whatever's left over goes to the cars, as opposed to what we do now, where whatever's left over goes to pedestrians, which is often nothing. Like this street in LA, we could get very different outcomes. All right, so I start my book off comparing traffic engineers to doctors because doctors have been around for 5,000 years. It's pretty easy to argue for the first 1,000 that they killed more people than they saved. But as an empirical science, they got better. Traffic engineering is only 100 years old. We're still in the stage where we're killing more people than we save. Why? And well, that's what I'm trying to show in the book is that a lot of the things we think are safer, their science isn't really there behind it. Um, the science isn't what we were led to believe. Like speaking of science, my oldest, who's now 20, when they were in elementary school, her science fair project, she asked kids at school how they felt that day, how she drew these little happy faces through the sad faces. And the kids that walked and bike were happier than the kids that were driven to school. And it was actually statistically significant. So it is possible to integrate happiness with it, but we need to build places that make that a possibility real and make it safe for everyone ages 8 to 80. So look back at my hometown where I showed you I had 8 or 9 elementary schools. They've cut it down to 3 to save money in overhead. They closed most of them. They expanded the remaining 3. Yes, they're saving money on administration or buildings, but they're spending millions now busing kids to school. Are kids safer? Maybe, but is this what we really want? So the last thing I want to leave you with is another thing from Marie Kondo is like, I want you to think about joy. What places spark joy? What streets spark joy? Why not design for these places? I was down in Bentonville, Arkansas last week to give a talk, and this is a parallel route to a trail that is fun for kids, and we can design around that. We can build places that make these things a possibility, or crosswalks like this one in Baltimore. Um, it might not be as fun as this kids train in Finland or the train I saw in the Wicked movie the other day. But we can make transportation fun for folks, for everyone, even at the 80 end of the spectrum. This is the Miles of Smiles nonprofit here in Colorado that lets people who may not be able to walk or bike as easily as they used to still experience that joy. So, but to make these things possible, we need to be intentional about how we build our cities and how we build our transportation systems. And we need to get the traffic engineers like me on board with that science because for the last century, what I show in the book is we've been leading you in the wrong direction. So thank you very much.
The last question is, what would be your call to action? People here, I say that we want people here to be politically, we want passionate advocates on whatever. And this is something, because also not only the people that die and also the people that are injured, but the people that actually do not walk or bike as a normal part of everyday life because they don't feel that it's safe. So also, a lot of people are staying home because it has become unsafe to even walk to school or to the park. And the last, I love the program you mentioned of the little kids in Japan, but the reality is that when we think about it, it's not very civilized that people, children and youth, 6 to 16, depend on someone with a car to go out for an ice cream or to go to a school or to visit a friend. Anyone 6 to 16 should be able to walk or bike to any of their basic needs. So what would be your call to action, Wes?
I went to a medical conference a couple of years ago, and like some of the doctors I talked to there would not suggest to their patients to walk or bike, partially because of air quality, but partially because it's not safe. And in a lot of places, they're not wrong. So we need to build better places. So my book is written, it's written in a way that it's not just for, to enlighten the traffic engineers like me to help us understand where we can do better. It's written in a way to sort of help everyone. I sort of go through a lot of the jargon that traffic engineers use to kind of shut down the conversation, to keep doing what they're doing without getting pushback. So I'm trying to teach people what those things really mean and give them the ammunition to have an argument with an engineer that they might be able to actually win. So the book itself is a call to action, and it's not just for the engineers. It really is for everyone. And I think hopefully the book can, give people the knowledge they need to be more effective in this space.
Thank you very much, Wes. And actually, that's why I decided to invite you because I do think that every one of your recommendations is not for PhDs, is not for engineers, it's for the population in general. So the population can also are able to speak to engineers, are able to speak to elected officials. And this has been great. Wes, thank you, thank you. What a great presentation. You have given us a lot of tools, a lot of food for thought so that all of us will become active. I hope that everyone that watches this video will share it with decision makers, with elected officials, with city staff, with the media, with advocates, with friends, with as many people as possible, because we need to make streets safe. It's just, we know what needs to be done, as you very well mentioned. It's not a technical issue or even a financial one. It's about policy, but not about political parties. Thank you, Wes, for such a wonderful presentation. And I hope that everybody will share it. And I'll see you 2 weeks from today.